Thank you very much, Banerjee sir. Good morning, everybody. Actually, Banerjee sir touched upon a very important topic, which was one of the critical factors that I analyzed in my research that I am going to present to you. My name is Amanpreet Singh. I am from Engineers India Limited. So my topic for the today is the Indian pathway towards net zero and the carbon neutrality. My research is done in 3 phases. First is I'll just quickly go through the background of my paper. Then I will introduce you to the research on research, that how much research is taking place across the world on the research topic of net zero. So that's one step ahead of the research status. So what I'll do, I have taken a bibliographic analysis of the net zero and the carbon neutrality. Then I'll see it's on the worldwide basis across the industries, and then I figure it down to the hydrocarbon sector, and then I did on this particular net zero a small survey was conducted on some of the variables that were extracted through a literature survey, and then I did a survey analysis through SPSS analytical tool. So I'll be presenting the analysis of that particular part. So this is where we stand as per the 2050 the gateway path towards the net zero. One thing is more important is that technology is going to play an important part. So if we're looking, if we want to achieve net zero emissions by 2040, here we want to be, our oil supplies has to reduce drastically, and at that point of time the composition of the wind and the solar PV is going to increase drastically to around 65% of our energy basket. Now if you look at the technologies, there are more than 50% of the technologies of which we don't know right now. They are still at the lab stage, or they are still under the pilot stage. So these are the critical 50% technologies which requires the industry backing, which requires the funding from the industry to make them to a commercial stage. Right now in market there are around 30% technologies. Some of those technologies are commercially viable, some are finding it very difficult on viability analysis, but the critical phase that the world is going to see in future is on the 50% of the technologies, how they are going to progress from the lab scale to a pilot scale to a commercial scale. So that's going to be the key to achieving the targets of net zero for any country that's in perspective. So these are the some of the these technologies are basically on green hydrogen based, on EVs, on next generation biofuels, energy efficiencies, CO2 storage and H2 storage. So if you see that in every country these technologies are going to play a pivotal role if you want to achieve the net zero targets. As Arindam sir has already said that he has covered it in quite detail. What are the finances that would be required to achieve this particular? That means the additional investment of around $3 trillion per year. So he has covered in more in detail. So I'll just skip this particular part. This is where we stand. India being a developing country, we have our own pathway. We have targeted to be a net zero and carbon neutral by 2070. We all know all this Amrit of what Honorable Prime Minister has given us on this particular. So I will move from this. Now this is what we see, what we had did that across the industries, what the research, where the research is going on 2 basic aspects of net zero and the carbon neutrality. So what we try to do, we went to a Scopus, the published journal. These are the published journals on every country on the countrywide basis. So we analyzed around 1900 papers, which are the high citation papers in last 10 years, and we find and all the papers that are in 2023, and we see that the most of the research that we find is being held in United States, UK and in European Unions. So in India we find, if you see at the bottom corner there is a small, now these linkages, what you see, there are 2 aspects of this particular bibliographic analysis. One is the size of the round, if I can say in a very broad term. It sees that how much research is going on, and there you can see some colorful lines. So these are the linkages, or the high linkages of how one country research is going to impact the other countries, and how it is getting interrelated. What we find from analysis, that most of the research which are being done in United States or in Europe are not interlinked with the Indian perspective. And Indian perspective, what we need right now is more research on net zero aspects and linking it to the global perspectives. So this particular linkage we find for the Indian subcontinent are being developed, but right now they are not at that par with the other developed countries. And from the country perspective, if we see the move to that, on the net zero perspective, what are the key parameters where the research right now is going on? These research, if you see that net zero, it is closely interrelated with the renewables, with the carbon neutrality, and in the middle you can see, because I have modeled it like this way, how India, if there's a small dot you can see in between, how our country is being interrelated with this particular research. So out of all this research, like from the net zero, right now most of the research is being done on the renewables, on the climate change, and from the net zero, it is more on the net zero buildings. So more and more research is required in oil and gas sector when we talk about the achieving the targets of net zero. So if you see, this is the contemporary heat map of the research that is being going on across the world on the net zero targets. You will see that on the net zero and on the climate change, it's a more focus. But on the country perspective, right now the more focus is on the US and the European Union. So what we want to see is, what we want, the one outcome of this particular research paper is that as an academia and as an industry, we need to have more contemporary research on this particular topic, and more contemporary research which is more linked to the various variables of the net zero that we are going to achieve in particular. So this is a contemporary heat map where we see that India again on a heat map is at a lower stage, but if we compare the heat map, of last 5 years and this year also, we find that this particular aspect is right now growing in the country. As we see after the COP26 declaration, I will see in the other side of the research. After COP26, the quantum of research in India on these particular topics, both in industry and in academics, is growing at a very fast pace. But this is still not enough for us to move at that particular part where we can say that our country research is at one of the best researchers that we have in India. Now we see on when I move from the industry basis, various sector, to the oil and gas industries, we see again the research is more focused on United States, but there are more research is also going in the Middle East and the Russian Federation and the Southeast Asia. So this we have moved from the complete value chain of net zero, which comprises all sectors, to a specific value chain which is only focused on oil and gas sector. So again we find that, as I said, that in oil and gas sector over the last, because this particular research contains around 23,000 papers that were published during this year on net zero. Out of this, around 30% papers were published in India. So that's why our standing on the research on this particular topic is increasing, but it has to increase at a much faster and much faster pace. Again, this is a contemporary heat map for India. If you see at the top right hand side, and one of the key factors that we identified from here, the heat map, is a innovation that you can see in the extreme left hand side corner, that the innovation in the emerging economies. So this particular part, like I said in the initial, that if like 51% of the technologies are still at the lab stage, But these particular lab stage, when they move to a pilot stage or commercial stage in the emerging economies, these particular innovations, that's a critical heat map, which and that's going to drive the net zero targets for our country. So there's a great linkage between the country perspective in this heat map with the oil and gas sector, net zero, and the innovations in emerging markets. Now, emerging economies does have India as one of the factors, but it does contain the other countries as well. So this is on typically on the Indian aspect. Again, the WASPWare analysis of 10 years of the Scopus data set that we did, we find that again in oil and gas sector, the contemporary research on the net zero was less during the last few years. We have scanned all the papers from the last 6 years from COP 25. Then we see that from 2017 till 2023, only 14% of the papers that were published on that particular net zero and carbon neutrality were from our country, from India. But if we see how the things are changing right now, as we speak today, till yesterday there were around 23,500 papers that were published as of now, as of February. Out of that, 26 papers were rated by the Indian researchers, by the Indian authors, and the heat map that we run, because we could not present it here, heat map is changing drastically. The interlinkages are changing drastically with reference to the Indian context. So one takeaway, the first takeaway from this particular bibliographic analysis that we did is that while we do a lot of things on net zero, it's very critical that we present that particular whatever we do as part of as a research paper which can be published, because that's going to have a more credibility when we go to the as compared to the European Unions and as compared to the US. So more what we do, we have to put it in a right frame, as part of the research which which can be published on this particular. So next part we introduce the second. This is a brief survey was carried out in the Indian hydrocarbon industry. What we did a systematic literature review of around 80 research papers. We used the PRISMA guidelines for this particular systematic review, and we identified 12 critical factors. 12 critical factors that are important for the hydrocarbon industry to achieve their net zero targets in 2070 at various in gradual phases. Now these particular variables, what we try to do, we developed a questionnaire on these particular variables, and we administered to the oil and gas respondents. This is one of the limitations that I would like to accept in this particular research, that we received respondents score of 64. We distributed to around 157 respondents. We wanted more responses, but due to the time constraint, this particular responses are still coming, but still we wanted to have a more than 125 or 130 responses to make this particular thing a more concise. So next step, but we run our analysis on this particular part, and we wanted to see that how these 12 variables, what we have identified, most of these variables, some of these are on the technology aspect, some are on the stakeholder aspect, and some are on research and development, and on the financial aspect. So in our analysis, we wanted to see that how these particular variables come together and form of various factors, and how much the weightage of that particular factor is for our industry to move forward. For example, this is the output analysis of the SPSS CFA we did see. If we see that all those 12 variables, they coincide, they merged into 3 factors. Now I'll come to those 3 factors briefly, and these 3 factors talks about, or these 3 factors would contribute around 72% of our efforts towards net zero. So the point is that we have lot many variables moving around where we want to work, So if we focus our energies on some of the critical factors that will be contributing more towards achieving our targets. So that's this particular research has come out that there are 3 major factors which would contribute around 70% of our towards achieving the net zero. That means these 3 factors require the most focus from the industry so that the targets can be achieved. So these are what we did again. Then we plotted a 3-dimensional component rotated matrix of this particular factors. We can see the factors are converging on this particular matrix on 3 components. Well, the KMO analysis find that the sample adequacy was adequate, but again, as a researcher, we find that the sample adequacy is still not adequate. We want to have more sample survey to make it more concise result. Now, when we factor these particular net zeros, when we map these factors, we find 3 major factors. As I told, that all those 12 variables, they coincide into 3 factors, which talks about which contributes to around 70% of our efforts towards net zero. Now, three factors. One is the technology, which would contribute around 30%, stakeholders around 26%, and research and development around 16%. So these 3 aspects are the key for the industry to take forward, to focus on, because if we focus on other variables are also important, but if we focus on those variables, the impact of that particular variables on our ultimate target of net zero will be minimal. So these 3 factors of technology, stakeholder, research and development are important because they will be impacting around 70% of our 70% on our targets for achieving net zero by 2070. So these 3 factors, as I said, that 12 particular identified variables, they converged into 3 factors. One was the technology, which converged into availability, accessibility and affordability. Stakeholder, the collaboration, culture and the policy frameworks coincided. One important aspect that coincided into stakeholder was the suppliers and the stakeholders. Means while we are doing our efforts to achieve a net zero targets, it's very important that we focus on our suppliers to adopt the net zero targets for themselves. And research and development, as I said, that the market competitiveness is a third important factor which will impact around 16% towards our achievement towards the net zero. Then there are 2 takeaways. One is there's in addition to these particular factors, one is that there is more research which is required on on the net zero and carbon neutrality in our country, both from the industry and academia. So one collaboration that we can always have of industry and academia is on the research publications. And this particular research model, as I said, that this particular model can be replicated to any industry. They have now the second step of this is we are trying to replicate this model into an automobile industry, because automobile industry is another stakeholder for our to achieving net zero. So some variables are going to be changed, but again the similar research will be doing on the automobile industry. So all this research, if you want to conduct in your organizations, you can always have this particular research data and the questionnaires and the SPSS softwares from me. You can always conduct within your organizations that what are the factors, the organization specific factors, because I've done it on an industry perspective, oil and gas sector, hydrocarbon perspective. But if we move on an organizational perspective, for a specific organization, what are the major factors that would influence or that would impact to achieving the net zero targets. So this particular standardized questionnaire, because this is already validated questionnaire and validated research, so always it can be replicated to the different industries, to the different organizations as well. So if anybody needs that to undertake this particular research in their organizations, I would be happy to share the research findings, the questionnaire and the SPSS model that I have developed for this particular thing. So that's it from my side. Thank you very much. I would like to introduce Ms. Lucy. She is from SCS Inspire, Sales Manager. She will be talking on the topic of EU Renewable Energy Directives 3. Welcome. Thank you.